We are going to be looking at Psalm 90. Now, how many people in here have trouble with their eyesight? Are there any nearsighted people in here? Okay, there's one guy over there. You got to hand it to nearsighted people. I mean, really, you have to hand it to them because they can't see it. Yeah. I had about 4 others, but I think maybe with that reaction, I think maybe I just better stop at 1 there. In life, it's really easy to become nearsighted. You know that word's actually in the Bible. It's in, I think, 1st or 2nd Peter chapter 1. I don't remember which one anymore. I didn't make it up. It just came to me right now that actually is in the Bible. It's actually a pretty myopic. It's actually a pretty cool word. And what I mean by in life, sometimes we get myopic, and that means that we develop nearsightedness in that we only see what's right in front of us. And the difference between being human and being divine is that God is playing a much different game than we're playing. God is playing a long game, and sometimes, we're so nearsighted that we can only see what's happening right now at this moment in our lives. But there's much more, beyond that. We're reminded of that, time and time again, in the scriptures that, we need to have a greater vision than just, what's happening in my life right now, or even what's happening, over the course of my life in the next year, or 10 years, or 20 years, should the Lord tarry. But really, we need to have an eternal perspective on life. I'm going to be looking at Psalm 90 here this evening, and Psalm 90 sort of helps reset our vision. It sort of reminds us to to simply step away from our narrow focus on what's right in front of us, and puts it on God's great designs and God's great plans are beyond just simply this realm of time. Now, Psalm. Do I have control here? Here. This is always the scary part. There, look at that. How about that? We're going to look at a little historical background here. That's Rich. Thank you, Rich. We're looking here at some historical background behind Psalm 90. It is the only psalm written by Moses. Now, it's not the only song written by Moses. Moses has a few other songs, in the scriptures. One in the book of Exodus. This one, Psalm 90. And there's one other, as well. I can't quite remember where it is. But what's that? In Deuteronomy? Yeah, probably. I just couldn't remember where the third one was. This is the only, psalm out of the Psalter that's recorded, to have been written by Moses. And when you look at the psalm, people always try to, link up some kind of historical background, to the psalm, which motivated, the writer. And so based upon the themes that we see in the psalm, many have suggested, and it's impossible to be dogmatic about this, but many have suggested, that this psalm grew out of the events that happened in Moses' life between Numbers chapter 14 and Numbers chapter 20. I think that there's good reason to see that could possibly have been the case. In Numbers chapter 14, through chapter 20, you have probably one of the darkest periods in Moses' life. Remember that Moses had been called by God to lead the people out of Egypt. You remember that that after they had had that grand confrontation with Pharaoh and the 10 plagues and the death of the firstborn and the parting of the Red Sea, and they saw God's miraculous works as He divided the sea there, and the children of Israel went through, and Pharaoh's armies were ruined. And by the way, that's one of Moses' first song. I will sing unto the Lord, and I will triumph gloriously, for the horse and rider has been thrown into the sea. And those are the words of Moses' first song there, in Exodus. After that, the people, travel to Mount Sinai, and God there gives them the law. He gives them His expectations, for the people. They enter into a covenant with God. They agree to do all that Moses commanded, or that God commanded them through Moses. This wasn't something that God just says, you're going to do this. No, they agreed to do that. God entered into a covenant with them. And God said, if you obey, I'll do this. But if you disobey, I'll do this, right? And I'll bless you for obedience, and I'll bring discipline upon you for disobedience. And so this was the whole period of that time when they're there before the mountain at Sinai. And then, they begin to travel, toward the promised land, and they don't set out very long before they begin to grumble, before the people begin to complain. Life is different. It's hard. God is providing for them through manna, through many other blessings that he gives them to take care of the people, and yet they're still grumbling and complaining. They're complaining against the lack of water. They're complaining against the food that they ate in Egypt. They're complaining against Moses' leadership. Time after time after time, they continue to complain. Moses pleads with the people to stop doing that. God's upset with the people for their murmuring and complaining and their failure to trust him. And remember that what was God doing? He's leading them to the promised land, right? So finally, he brings them, to the gates of the promised land at Kadesh, and that's where the disaster at Kadesh ensues. God says, here you are. You're at the very verge of the promised land. Now go in and take this land that I've given to you. It's the ultimate blessing that I promised to your forefathers, all the way back to Abraham. And the people of Israel say, nope, we're not going to do that. After they send out the spies, you guys know the story, right? They send out the 12 spies. The 12 spies come back. 10 of them have a bad report. Only 2 guys had a good report. Who were they? They were Joshua and Caleb. The 10 say, hey, listen, there's no way we can take that. We don't have an army. We don't have weapons. We're not trained. They've got fortified cities. The people are like giants. There's no way. We try to take this land. We're going to die. God says, all right, that's it. He goes, now you've tested and tried me these 10 times in the wilderness. And so God declares, that, listen, because you refuse to obey me, now this promised land blessing that I desired to give you, you can no longer get. And so none of you are going to enter into the promised land. You're going to wander in this land. You're going to wander in this wilderness until every member of this generation that complained and grumbled, even though they saw what I did when I led them out of Egypt. Remember, they walked through the Red Sea. So the God who stood the waters on the end couldn't help them fight these people in the promised land. Really, people, right? Like, come on. They had every reason to trust God. He had given them every reason. He delivered them out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And so finally, the people are there at, and the judgment has befallen them. He says, every member of that generation, 20 years old and older, is going to perish in the wilderness. After chapter 14, that's when that judgment comes down. We then have in the succeeding the chapters after 14, you have the death of Miriam, who is Moses' sister. Then you have the death of Aaron, who is Moses' brother. And during that time as well, in between those two stories, you have the judgment. At the rock, when again the people of Israel are complaining and grumbling, we don't have anything to drink, and so God tells Moses, strike the rock. And what does Moses do? He said, strike it once. What did Moses do? He struck the rock twice. It isn't so much that he struck the rock twice, but it's the attitude in which he did it. And God said, all right, Moses, for that, you're not going to see the promised land either. And so Moses, was not able to see the promised land. But I want you to sort of zone in on what's happening then. So they're wandering for 40 years until that generation dies off. It's estimated that 2 million people came out of Egypt. Now, we don't know exactly what that number is, but I've heard everything from 1 million, a couple 100,000 to 3 million. That's the top number I've ever heard anyone say. So you don't know exactly how many people came out, but it was a mighty nation, right? And that was God's promise. It was God's promise to Abraham. I'm going to make you a mighty nation. Your offspring are going to be numerous, right? That was one of his promises, and it was in Egypt that happened. Even if you took 2 million, people that came out of Egypt, how many funerals per day do you think were happening during that time? And so Moses has now buried, all of these people, day after day after day that are dying. He's buried his sister. He's buried his brother. He's struggling under the knowledge that he won't see the promised land, that the people keep disobeying. And in Psalm 90, we see this. The superinscription says, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. The scripture chooses to memorialize Moses as a man of God. Was Moses perfect? No. Do you have to be perfect to be a man of God? A woman of God? No. We're going to mess up. We're going to make mistakes, but we can still love him. And that's what's most important to God, right? That we love him, that we turn from our sin, that we get up when we fall down, exactly. And so, this is the background of the psalm, and it's very sad, right? And so a lot of people read this psalm, and they can hear the sorrow in Moses, the man of God's words. But it seems to also transcend that sorrow and is hopeful and restorative of purpose and restorative of vision. And gives us great wisdom for how to live our lives, not for just the here and now, but for eternal purposes. And so it is wonderful. It's beautiful. Let's dig into it together in the time that we have remaining. O Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. You know what? I should probably do this. There you go. Oh Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. I just got done preaching on Sunday morning and they changed the slides for me. So now I'm so lazy because I got to remember I got to change the slides myself. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, you brought forth the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God, right? So he begins, this psalm, with a couple things about the Lord. You have been our dwelling place throughout the generations. Going all the way back to Abraham, the Lord, Adonai, Israel's master has been their God. He's been the one that's cared for them. He's been the one that's been gracious to them. He's the one that's led them. And so, he's been their refuge. He's been their fortress. He's been their dwelling place throughout of all of Israel's generations since their inception, with Abraham. And then he says this, before the mountains were born. Now, when were the mountains born? We got to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 for that. From the story of creation. The mountains are old, right? A lot older than you and I. The mountains were here before we were born. They're going to be here after we're dead, right? They have a sense of permanence. I love the mountains. You can have the beach. I'll take the mountains. You can have the sand everywhere. I'll take the mountains. Because when I climb a mountain or, when I get up in the mountains, there's a tremendous sense for me, of just the power and the majesty of God. You're standing on this incredible thing, this huge, permanent mountain. You think about how amazing God is, right? Before the mountains were born or you brought forth the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Kenny talked, tonight, about the permanence of God. And that's exactly, what this is talking about right here, that God is permanent. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You know what? That's not a description of us. We are not everlasting, right? We didn't have, we had a beginning. We're here for a little while, and then what? And then we're gone. We stand in great contrast to God, right? That in this life, in our days, in our mortal flesh here, we're here for a little while, and then we're like the chaff that blows away. Our lives are brief, and life is fleeting. And Moses was all too aware of that, having to preside over many of those funerals and oversee all of that, and losing his brother, and his sister, and so you get that sense of, Moses, feeling, his own mortality here, can't you, right? But yet comparing that to God, and calling out to him. That God, before the mountains were born, you are God from everlasting to everlasting. No beginning and no end. Nothing in this realm of time lasts. Yet God, what? Never changes. God never changes. Everything in our world is always changing, continually. And it changes rapidly. By the time we get used to our situation, the situation's already changing. By the time you get used to what age you are, you're already aging out of that age and you're going on to the next phase of your life, right? And then before you know it, you're old. And you take your next step, into eternity. Now, we are the people who live in an ever-changing, existence, yet God never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Very good. And so, this whole, opening, stanza is a confession of God's permanence in the face of man's transitory nature. Make sense? He says this then about people, about himself. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch, in the night. This is where, if you ever go to a funeral and you go to a committal, the committal part of a funeral is when they place the body in the ground. And it's, just about every, movie out there, the expression, at a committal, they say, ashes to ashes and what? And dust to dust. Now, why do they say that? Because man was created, from the dust, from the ground, right? God formed man's body, you mean from the dirt, you mean from the dust of the ground. And you mean you leave me in the coffin, you mean for a couple years, and what do I turn back into? I turn back into dust, right? That reminds me of the young boy. Young boy, you mean he was very upset when he got home from Sunday school. You mean, and he said to his mom, Mommy, is it really true? You mean that we come from dust and we go back to dust? And his mommy said, yes, son, that's true. And he sort of, well, Mom, I think someone's either coming or going under my bed. Listen, guys, I work really hard for those jokes. I mean, I'd appreciate at least a pity laugh. All right. But look at the imagery once again. You mean that we were from dust. God creates us, and very quickly we turn back into dust. And who presides over all that? God does. Why does that happen? I mean, why do we experience death? Okay, death as a result of sin, right? Remember that God didn't create death. Originally. That God designed Adam and Eve to live forever, with God in a relationship with Him. And He warned them, in the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in that day, you will surely what? You will surely die. And when mankind fell and then they passed on that sin nature to everybody else, it's, death as a result of our sin. And so, Moses is aware of that. Moses understands that. He's experiencing that. People are dropping, in the desert all around him. And he is painfully aware of his own mortality. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. And then the next stanza there in verse 4, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by. We can't even conceive of 1,000 years. When we live, at best, around, if you're lucky, you might, live to be 100, in this world. There's very few people that make it that far and very few people that make it past that. But to live 1,000 years, and the Lord's lived more than 1,000 years, right? He's from everlasting to everlasting. And so 1,000 years in God's sight, is like just one day. And not even like a day, but He further reduces the that time frame, not just to a day, but to a watch in the night. How long was a watch in the night? 4 hours. Yep, 4 hours. That was a watch in the night. If you were out, on a wall of a city, and you were to keep guard, they switched the guards every 4 hours, you're throughout the night, and so that was your watch. And you were able to, make sure that, you weren't going to be attacked, by anybody unaware. And so he says, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day. Oh, nope, not even like a day, only like a couple hours. Just a brief, watch, in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. And they are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. And these illustrations remind us, of the brevity and the frailty of life. You sweep people away, in the sleep of death. That seems to be, the idea of a flood. You sweep people away like flood waters. In the sleep of death, like, 1 minute you're here and the next minute, your eyes are closed and it's like you just fell asleep, right? You're like the new grass, in the morning. The morning it springs up new, and by evening the grass is dry and withered. Sometimes you see that with flowers. And so not only is life, very short, but it's also very fragile, right? And we understand that. And so, these two illustrations, Moses is reminding, himself and reminding those that will read this, the brevity of life and the frailty of life and how precious it is. And then we come to him, focusing a little more, right here on, on why he's in this present condition. He says, we are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence, and all our days pass away under your wrath, and we finish our years with a moan. Now, again, the reason why people were dying all around Moses was because of their disobedience. Now, again, there's a general principle that people die because of sin. And that's why death has come to all men. That's why everybody dies, right? But in this particular instance, all these people, are dying for the specific reason, that they disobeyed God and failing to go in and believe in God to take the promised land. And so he's saying that, we're sitting here, under your discipline, And we can't go into this promised land until every single person dies. And so literally, we're waiting and wandering in this desert to die. That's a tough thing. It's a tough pill to swallow. That's hard. And Moses realizes that he's one of them now. He doesn't get to go into the promised land either. And so that's why he says, we're consumed by your anger. And we're terrified by your indignation. For you have set our iniquities before you and our secret sins in the light of your presence. He says, all our days pass away under your wrath, and we finish our years with a moan. The word for moan here, I would like to translate that word with a sigh. You know what a sigh is when you just go, ah. You see the, ah. That's your life. And we finish our years with a last breath. It's very poetic. A bit gloomy, but very poetic. And again, why is this happening? Why are all their days passing? They're passing because they're under God's chastisement. They're under God's discipline. Does God still love them? Yes. Did he forgive them? Yes, very clearly states that in the passages. Did he bless them in other ways? Sure. They had clothing that didn't wear out, shoes that didn't wear out. He still took care of their needs. I'm sure they still had some joyful moments with family. But they were wandering in that wilderness until that generation completely passed away. Until they finished their years with a moan. Verse 10, he estimates our lifespan. He says, our days may come to 70 years, or 80 if our strength endures. And I find this interesting, and it was written, thousands of years ago. And it's pretty much true today. That the average human lifespan is probably, somewhere, 70, 80 years, something like that. That's about, what people live. You live into your 80s, I feel like, if I get in, I could say that right now, but God doesn't know me anything, man. I've seen a lot in life. I've been able to do a lot in life. I feel like if I died today, I'd be like, well, Lord, I lived a great life. I'm so thankful for what you've done for me. God doesn't know me another day, but man, oh man, that's about right. It's 70, 80 years. He says 70 years or 80 if you have the strength, he says. If you're an extremely strong person, you might live into your 80s, right? But yet for the best of them, they are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. I see our lives are short compared to the everlasting nature of God, compared to the everlasting nature of the mountains. Our days are very short. And even the days that we do have are often filled with what? Trouble and sorrow. See, that's the sad, condition, that we're in because, of the ravages of sin, the prices that sin had brought, to people. When we disobey God, and when we hurt others, and when we kill and lie and steal and rape and pillage and take advantage and exalt power over others, this is the ugliness of the human life. That there's so much ugliness that comes. So much trouble, and sorrow that, we encounter in our lives. That's our lot. Trial is our lot, in a fallen world. We live in a fallen world. The Bible says a lot about that. One of the reasons why I love the Bible? Because, man, the Lord is always real with us. And the authors of Scripture were real with us. They don't create some picture that isn't the case. They give you a realistic look of life, and yet in the midst of that, they still give you hope. They still give you a way forward, even in the middle of accurately describing the human condition. Our lives are brief, frail, and filled with trial and sorrow from time to time. That's everybody, not just you, not just me. We all experience that. If only we knew the power of your anger. If they knew that, then they wouldn't have what? Disobeyed. I want to tell you what happened in the story. You see, after they rebelled and refused to go in, you know what God said? God said, I'm going to wipe all these people out right here and now. You know what Moses did? Moses said, please, Lord, for the sake of your name, what will the other nations say if you wipe out your people? For your own name's sake, Lord, spare them, forgive them. And the Lord says, okay, Moses, I'm going to forgive them. But they're still going to die in the wilderness. And then when the people heard, what God had said, and the judgment that had befallen them, you know what they did? That they had the absolute nerve to say, wait a minute, hold on, God. We'll do it this time. We'll go. We'll go into the promised land now. And then the Lord said to them, don't you dare. Don't make another mistake. Don't you dare. You go into that, you're going to get whooped up on, man. And so they go running off to battle. They go running off to try to take the promised land like God said, and God didn't go with them. And they got romped on that. They got completely crushed and came running with their tails between their legs, back out of the promised land again. So no, I told you that blessing is gone. See, even when God disciplined them, they still didn't listen. They still didn't obey. And so Moses is here saying, if only we would have known the power of your anger. If we realize, the discipline of the Lord, sometimes, we wouldn't do some of the things that we do, right? And he says this, your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. That's an amazing phrase right there. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. And it's good for mere mortals whose lives are fleeting to have, the most healthy fear of the Lord possible. I hear people tell me all the time that word fear just means respect. And I'm sure that respect is included into the word. But I'm telling you right now, it's more than respect. I had an earthly father. My father was not abusive to me. He did abandon our family, but he wasn't abusive to me. He tried to teach me, when he had time, the few times that he did spend with me, he tried to teach me what was right. And I want to tell you something, I had some fear for him, because if I did wrong, I knew what? I was going to get a whooping. Not abuse. I'm going to get a whooping. I didn't want a whooping. So I had a healthy fear. And it was fear. And it was real. Did I know my dad loved me? Yeah. Those two things are not exclusive to one another. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. And then verse 12, one of the most amazing verses in all the Bible. Teach us to number our days. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. What's the meaning of that? We're going to tear that apart in a second here. Teach us to number our days. What does that mean? Okay, walk where the hell? What? Okay, live every day to its fullest. And I would say not just to its fullest, but for the honor and glory of God, right? I'm going to live every day for the honor of glory. I'm going to make every day count, because I don't know what. I don't know which one's going to be my last. Life is fleeting. My life is short. My years pass away with a moan. I return to dust. I'm like a flower that grows up in the morning and withers by the evening, man. So I better make darn sure that I make great use of every day God gives me. Now, we take the Bible literally here at this church? How about the rest of you? We do, right? We do take the Bible literally, right? So let's do a little math. Again, this is dangerous ground for Pastor Jeff, because Pastor Jeff stinks at math. And I know, if there's going to be a guy in the room that's going to check my math, it's going to be Eric. I absolutely know 100% it's going to be that weasel over. Pastor Jeff, you got some numbers wrong there. If I got some numbers wrong, Eric, I apologize. You can correct me later. But I literally, honestly took this, because he's a numbers guy. I'm sure he has a mathematical mind, right? And maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think he does. So let's just take a look at this. The Bible said that if I'm strong, I might live. My average lifespan of a human being is 70 years, or 80 if what? If I have the strength. So let's use 80 years. If I lived 80 years, that's 29,200. Do not get your calculator out. I see you people reaching for your calculator. Just put it away. That's 29,200 days that I have to live. Now, I want you to stop to think about that. You don't even know you're alive until you're about what? 5? I don't know. Maybe it's less than that. Maybe I never had kids, so I don't really know that. But I know when you're a baby, you don't really understand what's going on, right? So you got to subtract a few of those. Now, me personally, since I'm applying this to my own life, I am 56 years old, right? So I've lived, approximately 20,440 days at 56 years old. You know how many days that leaves me? 8,760 days left. Now when you stop to think about the fact that that's the 24-hour days, but I'm not really able to do anything for 24 hours because I got to sleep, what? 8 hours out of that day, right? So if I subtract 8 hours from the remaining days that I have, that takes off another 2,920 days, leaving me with 5,840 days, assuming that I live to age 80. Now, some horrifying statistics. The average person who starts driving at 16 years old will spend 180 days sitting at red lights. Dude, that one blew me away. That absolutely blew me away. That's like, whoa, bro, that's crazy. The average woman, if she looks in the mirror 30 minutes a day, will spend 532, because no guy spends a half an hour looking at himself in the mirror, and if you do, I need to see your man card afterward. I'm going to give you a punch. I'm going to take it away from you for a few days, but if you're staring at yourself in the mirror for 30 minutes a day, that's 532 days. The average person looks at a screen between 4 and 6 hours a day. That's 4,258 days looking at a screen. Teach us, O Lord, to number our days. Man, my days are, the clock's ticking. Again, I don't even know if I'll make 80. Who knows? Only the Lord knows that. But when you start looking at it in terms of this, boy, it's like, whoa, sheesh. That's not much. I have such little time to make my life count for the Lord. Teach us, Lord, to number our days. And then what's the next phrase? That we might gain a heart of wisdom. See that? See, the reason to think about the number of your days is that would produce the wisdom to understand how brief your life is and that you would make the time that you have remaining count for the Lord. To live with an eternal purpose. Not to be myopic, not to be short-sighted, not to just, look at this, but to look beyond. And to say, what is my life accomplishing for God? Why would I want to spend my entire remaining days under God's discipline because I'm a knucklehead and I keep disobeying God? Right? That's what Moses is saying here. We're in this judgment. All these people are dying and because we disobeyed God. Man. And here we are, passing our days under his wrath. Make sense? Lord, teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom, to live them for the honor and glory of the Lord and for his eternal kingdom. Because that's the only thing that's going to last beyond the grave. It's the things you do for Christ. It's a great verse in Revelation. It says, that about believers, who have died, and it says, and their works do follow them. That's their good works. That's their works that they did for the Lord, the works that they did for Christ. Those things that were of eternal value. Coming to church, learning God's word, sharing it with others, encouraging your brothers and sisters, praying for one another, praying and talking to God, thanking God, worshiping God, singing to God, praising God. Those will never, ever, ever pass away. Those are eternal actions that follow us beyond the grave. Don't waste your life in disobedience and discipline and squander your days, but invest each one for the future. That's what the point of numbering your days is. I haven't done this every once in a while I come back and I teach this psalm. I probably taught this psalm 20 times. And every time I teach this psalm, I get this new number. And every time I see the number, less and less. It's like, oh boy, clock's ticking. Verse 13, relent, O Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love. You see, God's hand was heavy upon them. Satisfy us, in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all of our days. That's beautiful, isn't it? That is unbelievable. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants and your splendor, notice the word, to their children. You know what Moses is praying for? The next generation. And I don't believe just the next generation, but I believe that they could have had times of joy there in the wilderness as well, even though they were under God's judgment. But Moses is especially praying for that next generation. May they have gladness as many days as they've had to suffer under God's discipline, and for as many years as they've seen trouble. And may your deeds be shown to your servants and your splendor to their children. So you can see why that was on Moses' mind, to pass on who God is and what obedience looks like, and learning the lessons, pass it on to the next generation. See that? Because they couldn't get out of that discipline that they were under. But the next generation going into the promised land had a choice before them. And the choice is, will we do better? See, everybody that's had, a bad parent, everybody that's had difficult things, happen to them in their lives, had a bad deal, had a poor upbringing, had this, had that. They all have to ask themselves this question. Am I going to repeat the mistakes, of the past, or am I going to be different? See, you don't have to grow up to be just like your rotten father or your rotten mother or this person that did this to you. No, I don't have to. I'm not doomed to that. My life can be different. And so we teach the children, do better than I did, son. Do better than I did, daughter. The next generation. Pass that on. The Lord's splendor and the Lord's mighty deeds. You should serve him as a great and awesome God. And then, the last verse, and this is a fitting conclusion to the psalm. He says, may the favor of the Lord our God rest on us and establish the work of our hands. And he says it twice. Yes, establish the work of our hands. What he is asking, in this prayer, is that from this moment on, even when under judgment and into the next generation, that the people of God would do things with their hands that would honor and glorify the Lord. And that those works would be established in permanence and would live on beyond them. He's talking about a legacy. You see, you can waste your life on all kinds of worldly crap, and in the end, what will your life be worth? Nothing. It had no eternal value. But if you invest your life for the things of the Lord, those things are permanent as God is, because he remembers them forever. In closing, I'm trying to think if it's, I think it was, doggone it. There was a pizza company, and I think it was called Tombstone. Years ago. Now, I think they've fallen out of popularity or whatever, but they had these commercials. And in the commercials, it was like you could choose your toppings on your pizza, and their tagline was, what do you want on your tombstone, right? And that's a great question, right? Like, what do you want? By the way, did you notice my PowerPoint slides has a great Jewish graveyard, in the back there? Those are those high-level things, that you don't get just anywhere else, so just pay attention to that. That's a Jewish graveyard over there in Israel. So anyway, in case you didn't know, went along with the theme. But, what do you want on your tombstone? Like, that's a great question, right? Like, what do I want people to say about me? Now, I want to tell you something. I'm a pastor, and I presided over, I don't even know how many funerals. I can't count them. There's a lot. I've seen people, die, from this church for 34 years, and I've been at the funerals. So many. I've done many of them. Some for people that I've known extremely well and have been close personal friends with, and some that have been in the church. And they might have been in church for 20 years, but they never did anything. Just kind of came, went out the back door. Could never get them involved. Some funerals are really easy to do as a pastor because, one of the things that you do is you talk about the person. And then you try to, in one sermon, you try to do some things that sum up the person's life. Like, how do you sum up a person's entire life, right? It's pretty tough, right? Some people I can easily come up with things like, oh, I remember they did this, or I remember they did that, or this they did for the Lord, or they were great. And other people, I'm like, well, what did they do? And I'm like, I can't think of one thing that they did for the Lord. They've been in the church for 30 years. That doesn't mean he didn't do anything for the Lord. It just means I didn't know about it. Certainly didn't do anything through the church. Like, what do I say? I got nothing. Like, it's a really weird thing. What do you want people to say about you at your funeral? You know, what do you want them to remember you as? I think about this a lot because as a pastor, I have to deal with death all the time because, again, we're doing funerals every week. I got one on Friday. And I ask myself that question. So what do I want people to, what's the first thing that I want people to say about me when I'm gone? He was a good disc golfer. Nah. He was a knucklehead. I'm okay with that one. But I think more than anything is he believed God's word, he studied God's word, and he tried to teach it as best he could. If I could leave one legacy behind, that's what I would want to leave behind. That's what I would want people to remember. Now, how well I'm accomplishing that, I mean, I don't know. That's for God to judge and for others to judge. But if I would want one thing, that would be the one thing that I would want to live on past me. A love for God's word and a love to teach that and to share it with others and to encourage others with it. What do you want your legacy to be? What do you want God to establish from the work of your hands?